October 1888. The notice was delivered by a boy of no more than 17, his face a mask of nervous politeness. He worked as a clerk for Mr. Silas Croft, the superintendent of the Argent Consolidated Mining Company, and he held the single sheet of paper as if it were a writ of execution, which, in a way, it was. Elspeth Vance took it from him on the porch of the small clapboard house that had been her home for 6 years. The air at 9,500 feet was already thin and sharp with the coming winter, and the boy's breath plumed in small, apologetic clouds. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "Mr. Croft asked me to deliver this. He sends his regards." Elsie did not reply. She unfolded the paper. The language was formal, stripped of sentiment. It was a notice to vacate. The property, House 14 on the company plat, was owned by Argent Consolidated. Her husband, Arthur, had been granted its use as part of his compensation as a geological engineer. With his death in the No. 4 shaft collapse 11 months prior, her right of occupancy was terminated. The company had allowed her to remain through the spring and summer out of what the letter termed a gesture of consideration. That consideration had now expired. She was given 14 days. A final settlement of $50 would be paid to her upon surrender of the keys. The document was signed in a tidy, impersonal script by Silas Croft. She read it twice, her expression unchanging. The boy shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the crunch of gravel loud in the quiet afternoon. He clearly expected tears, or pleading, or some outburst of female hysterics that would allow him to retreat in a flurry of sympathetic noises. Elsie gave him none of it. She simply folded the paper back along its creases and held it in her hand. Her composure was a wall he could not breach. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, her voice even. She knew his name. His mother bought eggs from her when her hens were laying well. "You've done your job." The boy seemed to deflate with a mixture of relief and disappointment. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Croft said, he said if you have any difficulties, you're to speak with him at the company office." "I understand," she said. It was not an offer of help. It was an instruction to contain the problem within official channels. She did not look at the letter again, but at the mountain that loomed over the small town of Argent. The sentinel's spine, a long ridge of granite and limestone, was already gathering a dusting of snow on its upper reaches. The aspen groves that clung to its lower slopes had turned a brilliant, painful yellow, a last flare of color before the months of white and gray. Arthur had loved that mountain. He had walked it every Sunday, tapping at rocks with his hammer, making notes in his ledger. "That's all, then," the boy said, backing away from the porch steps. He almost tripped over his own feet in his hurry to be gone. Elsie watched him retreat down the dirt track toward the main cluster of company buildings, a small figure diminishing against the vast, indifferent landscape. Only when he was out of sight did she allow her gaze to drop back to the paper in her hand. 14 days. The 15th of October. Winter in the high country did not arrive by degrees. It fell like a hammer. To be without a roof over your head in these mountains after the 1st of November was a death sentence. The $50 was an insult, enough to pay for a funeral, but not for a life. The cruelty of it was not in its passion, but in its neat, bureaucratic efficiency. It was a line item in a ledger, the closing of an account. Arthur Vance, deceased. House 14, asset to be reclaimed. Elspeth Vance, widow, liability to be discharged. She stood on the porch for a long time, the cold wind tugging at the stray hairs around her face, until the sun dipped behind the western peaks and the world was cast in a deep, chilling blue. She felt no self-pity, only a cold, clarifying anger that settled deep in her bones, solid and heavy as granite. She went inside, leaving the door open for a moment to let the last of the light in. The house was 2 rooms, meticulously clean. Arthur's books were still on the shelf, his rock samples lined up on the mantelpiece. It was a house full of the quiet, intelligent presence of a man now turned to dust and memory. Closing the door, she lit the kerosene lamp on the kitchen table. The flame cast a warm, flickering glow, a small pocket of order against the encroaching dark. The notice to vacate lay on the table, a stark white rectangle in the center of the worn wood. It was a declaration of war, written on company letterhead, and Elspeth, standing in the sudden, profound silence of her empty home, understood that she had no choice but to answer it. She would not weep. She would not beg. She would calculate. That evening, Elspeth sat at the kitchen table where she and Arthur had shared more than 2,000 meals. She did not cook. She did not eat. Instead, she opened a small, cloth-bound ledger, the kind used for household accounts, and sharpened a pencil with a paring knife. On the first clean page, she wrote the date, October 1st, 1888. Then she began a bleak and honest assessment of her situation, treating her life as a set of figures to be added and subtracted. First, assets. She had, in a small tin box tucked beneath a loose floorboard, $112.40. This was the sum of her savings, accumulated from selling eggs and mending clothes for the miners' wives, supplemented by the meager amounts Arthur had been able to put aside. She added to this the $50 the company had offered, bringing the total to $162.40. It seemed a pitifully small number to stand between her and annihilation. Next, she listed her physical possessions. The furniture in the 2-room house, a bedstead, a table, 2 chairs, a washstand, was heavy and of little value. To transport it anywhere would cost more than it was worth. Arthur's clothes she had already given away to a young miner with a growing family. Her own wardrobe was sparse and practical. Her most valuable assets were Arthur's tools, a fine set of chisels, his rock hammers, a good handsaw, a shovel, and a pickaxe. These she listed with their approximate resale value, totaling perhaps $15. Then came the liabilities, the stark mathematics of survival. A stagecoach ticket to Denver, the nearest city of any size, cost $20. That would leave her with $142.40. A room in a respectable boarding house in Denver, she had heard, was $5 a week, assuming she could even find one that would take a woman of her age. She was 38 years old. She wrote the number down. 38. Not old, but no longer young. Boarding houses and factories hired girls in their late teens and early 20s. Girls who could work 14-hour days on their feet without complaint. They did not hire widows approaching 40, women whose faces were beginning to show the lines of work and worry. Women who carried the quiet grief of loss like a second shadow. She could, perhaps, find work as a laundress or a cook, but that was uncertain. And every week she spent searching for work would drain her small reserve of cash. At $5 a week for lodging and another $3 for food, her savings would last less than 6 months, and that was the optimistic projection. The one that did not account for illness or theft or the simple, grinding misfortune that so often clung to the unattached and the unprotected. She wrote down her options, numbering them in her neat, clear hand. 1. Leave Argent. Travel to Denver and seek work. High risk. Probable failure within 1 winter. 2. Remain in Argent, but where? The only lodgings were company-owned. No one would take her in. The miners and their families lived in fear of the company's displeasure. To shelter a person evicted by Argent Consolidated would be to risk their own home, their own job. 3. Appeal to Mr. Croft. Beg for an extension, for a different settlement, for mercy. She crossed this option out immediately. Her pride was a hard, unyielding thing, the last true possession she had. She would not give Silas Croft the satisfaction of seeing her humbled. He was a man who understood numbers, not mercy. To him, she was a cost to be eliminated. She sat back in her chair, the pencil still in her hand. The numbers on the page were clear and unforgiving. They described a box, a trap with closing walls. The town of Argent, which had been her home, was now hostile territory. The community she had served in small ways, with her eggs, her needle, her quiet presence, would turn its back. They had their own families to protect, their own narrow margins of survival. She could not blame them. The company was the sun around which their small lives orbited, and it could burn them as easily as it was now burning her. The silence in the small house deepened. The only sound was the faint hiss of the kerosene lamp and the ticking of the mantel clock, each tick measuring out the seconds of her 14 remaining days. She was alone. Her parents were long dead, buried in a churchyard in Ohio. She had no siblings. Arthur had been her only family. Now, he too was gone, his body interred in the cold ground alongside the other men lost in the collapse. She had no one to turn to, no one to write to for help. The realization did not bring despair, but a strange, cold calm. If she was to survive, it would be by her own hand, her own wits. The world had reduced her life to a simple, brutal equation. The answer was hers to find. She looked again at the list. There was no fourth option. She would have to create one. Sleep did not come. The numbers from her ledger seemed to be branded on the inside of her eyelids. After hours of staring into the darkness, listening to the wind rise outside, she got up. She lit the lamp again and went to the large wooden trunk at the foot of her bed. It held Arthur's personal effects, the things she hadn't been able to part with. His spare coat, a few worn shirts that still smelled faintly of him, and at the very bottom, his books. Not the printed geology texts on the shelf, but his field books. There were 6 of them, leather-bound journals filled with his precise, angular handwriting and meticulous sketches. He had documented every ridge, every outcrop, every fault line within a 10-mile radius of Argent. For Arthur, the landscape was not just scenery. It was a text to be read, a complex story written in stone. Elsie sat on the floor, the books piled around her, and began to read. It felt like a conversation with her husband, a final consultation. She ran her fingers over the pages, over the drawings of rock strata and mineral veins. She found the entry in the 3rd volume, dated July 12, 1887. A warm, clear day she remembered well. They had taken a walk together up the lower slopes of the Sentinel's spine. He had wanted to show her a peculiar formation. The page was dominated by a detailed sketch of a limestone outcrop, heavily weathered and flanked by granite. He had drawn it from a dozen angles, with measurements and annotations. Hidden behind a thicket of mountain laurel and scrub oak, he had sketched a dark opening, a fissure in the rock. Beneath the drawing, his notes were characteristically precise. Karst formation in otherwise solid granite upthrust. South-facing fissure, approximately 3 feet high, 2 feet wide at entrance, appears stable, interior dry, protected from prevailing northwesterly winds. Southern exposure provides maximum solar gain, a significant thermal advantage at this altitude, 9,800 feet. Floor shows evidence of animal use, but no signs of recent habitation. Possible old prospecting claim, sealed by subsequent rockfall at rear of initial chamber. The limestone is soft enough to be worked with hand tools, worth investigating further. She remembered that day. He had pushed aside the branches to show her the opening. "A place like this, Elsie," he had said, his voice thoughtful, "is a gift from the mountain. It stays warmer in winter and cooler in summer. The rock holds the sun's heat. It's a natural shelter." At the time, it had been a simple lesson in geology, another glimpse into the way her husband's mind worked. She had filed it away as a pleasant memory, a moment of shared discovery on a summer afternoon. Now, his words returned to her with the force of prophecy. A gift from the mountain, a natural shelter. Arthur had not been a religious man, but he had a deep and abiding faith in the logic of the earth. He had left her not money nor property, but something far more valuable: knowledge. He had left her a map. He had, without knowing it, prepared her for this exact moment. This was his inheritance. She held the journal to her chest. The worn leather was cool against her skin. For the first time since the boy had delivered the notice, she felt a flicker of something other than cold resolve. It was not quite hope, but it was a possibility, a fourth option that had not been on her list. The plan that began to form in her mind was audacious, desperate, and perhaps insane. But it was hers. It was a path forward, a way to answer the company's cold calculation with a fierce and cunning geometry of her own. She would not be evicted. She would move. She would take the inheritance Arthur had left her and dig herself into the side of the mountain. She would survive the winter not in spite of the wilderness, but by becoming a part of it. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen over the eastern peaks, Elsie was moving. She packed a canvas sack with a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, a ball of twine, and one of Arthur's smaller rock hammers. She dressed in her sturdiest boots and a worn wool coat. She did not look back at the small house as she left. It was already a place of the past. Her focus was on the mountain. The 2-mile walk to the location Arthur had marked was a steady, lung-burning climb. The trail was little more than a game path that wound its way up through stands of ponderosa pine and groves of skeletal aspen. The air grew thinner, colder, the silence broken only by her own breathing and the occasional call of a jay. She moved with a steady, unhurried pace, the way Arthur had taught her, conserving her energy for the work ahead. At approximately 9,800 feet, just as his journal described, the terrain shifted. The soil grew thin, giving way to weathered granite outcrops and patches of limestone that looked like old, cracked bone. She found the thicket of mountain laurel, its leathery leaves still green against the encroaching autumn brown. Just behind it, obscured by a tangle of scrub oak, was the fissure. It was exactly as Arthur had sketched it, a dark, unassuming slit in the rock, easily missed by a casual observer. The entrance was low, requiring her to get on her hands and knees. She hesitated for only a moment, then pushed aside the branches and crawled inside. The air within was still and cold, with the clean, mineral scent of dry earth and stone. After her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the entrance, she could see the shape of the chamber. It was larger than she had imagined. The floor was mostly level, a mix of dirt and gravel, sloping gently downwards from the entrance, which would ensure good drainage. The ceiling, a rough vault of limestone, was high enough for her to stand upright in the center, perhaps 7 feet at its peak. She paced it out. roughly 10 feet wide and 12 feet deep. It was not a cave so much as a hollow, a natural room carved into the mountain's flank. She took out Arthur's rock hammer and tapped the walls, listening to the sound. The granite sides were solid, ringing with a dull thud. The back wall, as he had noted, was limestone, and it produced a softer, more hollow sound. This was the wall he had suspected was a seal. The entire structure felt immensely solid, protected by the mass of the mountain itself. It was dry, no sign of seeps or dampness on the walls or ceiling. A thin crack high up near the back wall seemed to provide natural ventilation, drawing air through the space. Most importantly, the entrance faced due south. Even now in the early morning, the sunlight was beginning to touch the rocks around the opening, and she could feel a faint warmth radiating from them. In the depths of winter, the low southern sun would shine directly into the mouth of the chamber for several hours a day. The granite and limestone would absorb that heat, thermal mass, Arthur had called it, and radiate it back out through the long, cold night. The shelter was a piece of natural engineering, a passive solar structure designed by geological forces over millennia. She stood in the center of the chamber, turning in a slow circle. This could work. This could actually work. It was a desperate gamble, but it was founded on sound principles, on the knowledge her husband had so carefully gathered. This was not a hole in the ground. It was a foundation. It was a place to make a stand. She spent another hour there, clearing away loose stones from the floor, measuring the dimensions with her length of twine, and scratching notes and calculations onto a flat piece of shale with a sharp rock. By the time she crawled back out into the daylight, her mind was no longer occupied with the injustice of the eviction notice. It was filled with plans, with the practical problems of construction and logistics. How to build a door, where to place a stove, how much firewood would be needed. The fear and anger had been burned away by the cold fire of purpose. Elsie walked back down the mountain, her steps lighter than they had been on the ascent. She did not go back to the company house. Instead, she walked directly to Abernathy's general store, the hub of the small town's commercial life. The store was a long, low building smelling of coffee, cured meat, and oiled leather. Mr. Abernathy stood behind the counter, a stout man in his late 60s with a fringe of white hair and kind, discerning eyes. He had known Arthur well, respecting him as one of the few company men who did not put on airs. He had been quietly kind to Elsie since Arthur's death, always slipping an extra apple or a handful of candy into her basket. He watched her approach the counter, his expression one of gentle concern. "Elsie," he said, his voice a low rumble, "heard the news. That business with Croft is a damned shame." "It is what it is, Mr. Abernathy," she replied, her voice steady. She placed her list on the worn wooden counter. "I need to make some purchases." He picked up the list and read it, his eyebrows rising slightly. A good shovel, a pickaxe, a small cast-iron camp stove, 20 feet of stovepipe and a flue collar, a heavy 12 by 16-foot canvas tarp, a 10-pound box of assorted nails, sacks of flour, beans, and salt pork, coffee, lard, kerosene. It was not the list of a woman preparing to leave town. It was the list of someone digging in for a siege. He looked up from the paper, his eyes searching hers. He saw no desperation there, only a hard, focused determination that reminded him so much of her husband. He did not ask what she was planning. He understood that some undertakings are too fragile to be spoken aloud. To question her would be to introduce the possibility of doubt, and he could see that doubt was a luxury she could not afford. "All right, Elsie," he said, his tone all business. "Let's get you outfitted." She spent her money with the precision of a surgeon. She examined 3 different shovels before choosing one with a sturdy ash handle and a thick steel blade. It cost $3.50. The pickaxe was $2.75. The small stove, a 4-hole model called a sheepherder's delight, was the most expensive item at $12. She paid for everything in cash, counting out the bills and coins from her tin box onto the counter. The final tally came to $48.20. It was a massive portion of her savings, leaving her with just over $100 for any unforeseen needs. Mr. Abernathy gathered the items, his movements deliberate. As he loaded them onto a heavy handcart for her, he added several things that were not on her list: a large box of sulfur matches, a new whetstone for sharpening tools, and a thick gray wool blanket that had been woven by the Ute tribe. Elsie opened her mouth to protest, to say she couldn't afford them. He held up a hand. "On the house," he said gruffly, not quite meeting her eye. "Arthur. He helped me figure the grading for my root cellar. Never took a dime for it. Consider this a debt repaid." He finally looked at her, his gaze direct and filled with a quiet respect. "You take care of yourself, you hear?" "I will, Mr. Abernathy," she said. "Thank you." He simply nodded, then helped her push the heavily laden handcart out the door. The townspeople on the street watched her go, their faces a mixture of pity and curiosity. They saw a widow, cast out, pushing a cart of inexplicable supplies toward the mountain. They did not see a woman who had just declared her independence. Elsie ignored their stares. Her work had just begun. The labor was brutal, the most physically demanding work she had ever done. For 3 days, she did nothing but haul her supplies from the edge of town up the 2-mile trail to her shelter. The handcart was useless on the steep, rocky path. She had to carry everything on her back, load by punishing load. The stove was the worst. A dead weight of 70 pounds of cast iron that she wrestled and dragged up the slope, her muscles screaming in protest. Each trip left her breathless, soaked in sweat despite the cold air, but with every load she successfully deposited in the stone chamber, her sense of ownership grew. This place was being purchased not with money, but with the currency of her own sweat and endurance. Once the supplies were assembled, the real work of construction began. Her first priority was to investigate the back wall of the chamber. The limestone wall that Arthur had suspected was a seal. Using the new pickaxe, she started chipping away at the rock. The work was slow and exhausting. The limestone was softer than the surrounding granite, but it was still stone. For 4 days, she worked by the light of a kerosene lamp, the rhythmic thud-clink of the pickaxe the only sound. Her hands, unaccustomed to such labor, blistered, broke open, and bled. She wrapped them in strips of cloth from an old shirt and kept working. On the 5th day, her pickaxe broke through. Not into open air, but into a hollow space. The sound changed from a dull thud to a resonant boom. With renewed energy, she widened the hole, pulling out chunks of fractured limestone until the opening was large enough to crawl through. She lit her lamp and peered inside. It was another chamber, larger than the first, and it was filled with the dust of ages. A massive rockfall from the ceiling had sealed this inner room from the outer one, perhaps centuries ago. Crawling inside, she found a scene frozen in time. A rusted but remarkably intact prospector's stove stood in one corner, a length of stovepipe lying beside it. A crude bed frame, its wood now rotted to pulp, was pushed against the far wall. Near it lay a pickaxe with a shattered handle and a small tin lockbox. A human skeleton lay half buried in the dust and rockfall debris near the bed, a silent testament to the long-ago disaster. Elsie felt a pang of sorrow for the unknown man, but no fear. He was a fellow traveler, a person who had also sought refuge in the mountain. Inside the lockbox, she found a small, leather-bound journal. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was legible. It was the diary of a man named Jedediah Morse, dated 1863. He had come west to prospect for gold, but had holed up in this cave to avoid being drafted into the Union Army during the Civil War. He had lived here for over a year before a rock slide in the outer chamber had trapped him. His last entry was a scrawled, desperate prayer. He had died here, alone. The discovery was both sobering and transformative. She now had two chambers. The inner room, larger and completely protected from the elements, would be her storeroom and larder. The outer room would be her living space. Jedediah's stove was larger and more efficient than the one she had bought. After a day of cleaning and careful inspection, she patched a small crack in its side with wet clay from a nearby stream bed and determined it was sound. She had inherited not just a space, but a history and the tools of a previous survivor. Her next task was to secure the entrance. She spent a week gathering flat, manageable pieces of granite from the slope outside her cave. Using the principles of dry stack masonry that Arthur had once explained to her, she began building a low wall across 2/3 of the entrance, leaving an opening for a door. She lifted and placed each stone with care, fitting them together like a puzzle, using smaller stones to chink the gaps. The wall rose slowly, a testament to her patience and strength. It was 4 feet high and 2 feet thick, a formidable barrier against the wind and driving snow. For the door itself, she built a frame from the straightest aspen limbs she could find, lashing them together with twine and securing them with nails. She stretched the heavy canvas tarp over this frame, pulling it taut and nailing it down. With leather scraps for hinges and a carved wooden latch, she hung her new door in the opening. It was crude, but it was solid. When she pulled it shut for the first time, the chamber was plunged into a deep, comforting quiet. The howl of the wind reduced to a distant whisper. Her final and most crucial task was firewood. She knew from her years in Argent that a high-country winter could consume a staggering amount of fuel. She worked from dawn until dusk, felling dead, dry standing pines and aspens with her handsaw, bucking them into manageable lengths and hauling them back to her shelter. She stacked the wood in the inner chamber, organizing it by size and type: pine for quick, hot fires to warm the space in the morning, aspen and oak for slower, longer-burning coals to last through the night. When she was done, the entire back wall of the inner chamber was a solid mass of neatly stacked firewood, a bulwark of BTUs, a promise of warmth against the coming cold. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever built. The first test came in the second week of November. A storm rolled in from the northwest, a wall of bruised purple clouds that swallowed the peaks and descended upon the valley. The temperature plummeted from a mild 30 degrees to 10 below zero in less than 12 hours. The wind rose to a steady, shrieking gale, driving a blinding curtain of snow before it. In the town of Argent, people huddled in their drafty clapboard houses, stuffing rags into window cracks and feeding their stoves constantly. Elsie was sealed inside her fortress of stone. She woke that first morning to a world transformed. The only light in her chamber came from the flickering flames in Jedediah's old stove. The wind howled outside, but her canvas door barely trembled. The thick stone walls absorbed the sound, creating a profound sense of security. She lit her kerosene lamp and began her daily routine, a ritual of survival she had already perfected. First, the stove. She opened the firebox, the cast iron radiating a steady, life-giving heat. The coals from the oak logs she had banked the night before were still glowing. She added 2 pieces of dry pine, which caught immediately, and then 2 larger pieces of aspen. Within minutes, a steady, efficient fire was burning. She placed a pot of water on to boil for coffee. Next, she checked the temperature. She had hung a small thermometer, another of Arthur's tools, on the wall. It read a steady 55 degrees. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of ice and wind at 10 below. Inside her shelter, buffered by feet of earth and rock, it was warmer than her old company house had ever been on a winter morning. The thermal mass of the mountain was working, holding the previous day's solar gain and the stove's heat, bleeding it back into the space slowly and evenly. She prepared her breakfast with meticulous care. A small portion of salt pork fried in a pan, a cup of boiled beans, and a mug of strong black coffee. Food was fuel, and she rationed it as carefully as she rationed her firewood. After she ate, she made an entry in Arthur's journal in the blank pages at the back. She had started a new log. November 12th, 1888. First winter storm. Temperature outside estimated -10 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature inside 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind northwest 40 to 50 miles per hour. Wood consumption, 4 logs overnight, 4 logs morning. Rations stable. Shelter is holding. It is warm and dry. The storm raged for 3 days. Snow piled up against her door, not as a threat, but as a blessing. It drifted over the entrance, creating a natural tunnel that provided yet another layer of insulation. To go outside, she had to shovel her way through a narrow passage, emerging into a world of blinding white. The snow was 4 feet deep on the level ground and drifted much higher. She spent her days in the quiet, lamp-lit warmth of her shelter. She mended her clothes, sharpened her tools, and read from the one book she had brought with her, a copy of Shakespeare's plays. In the evenings, she read Jedediah's journal, his ghost a quiet companion in their shared sanctuary. She was not just surviving, she was comfortable. The systems she had put in place, the dry stack wall, the insulated door, the efficient stove, the well-managed woodpile, the natural thermal properties of the rock itself, were all working in concert. Her survival was not a matter of luck or brute endurance. It was a matter of engineering. It was the physical manifestation of her husband's knowledge and her own unyielding will. On the 4th day, the storm broke. The sun came out, dazzlingly bright on the new snow. Elsie shoveled her entrance clear and stood in the brilliant, silent world. The air was clean and cold, and the sky was a deep, impossible blue. She had faced the first and worst of the winter's fury and had not been found wanting. She was safe. She was warm. She was home. In January, the great cold descended. For 2 weeks, the temperature in Argent never rose above 0, and at night it plunged to 30 and even 40 below. It was a dry, merciless cold that found every crack in every wall, that froze water in buckets indoors, and made the simple act of breathing an agony. The town hunkered down, a pall of wood smoke hanging heavy and motionless in the frigid air. Fuel became a critical issue. Woodpiles, left exposed, were frozen solid, the logs brittle and difficult to burn. Many families, having underestimated the severity of the winter, began to run low. Mr. Abernathy, his mind troubled by thoughts of the widow on the mountain, finally decided he had to check on her. He bundled himself in his thickest coat, wrapped his face in a wool scarf, and made the difficult trek up the snow-packed trail, his snowshoes sinking with each step. He followed the thin, steady plume of smoke rising from her hidden stovepipe. When he arrived, he was astonished. He had expected to find a woman barely clinging to life in a miserable hovel. Instead, he found a scene of remarkable order and warmth. Elsie's shelter was a small island of comfort in the frozen world. The snow tunnel leading to her door kept the worst of the wind at bay. When she opened the canvas flap to his knock, a wave of warm, dry air washed over him. Inside, the chamber was a steady 60 degrees, lit by the warm glow of her lamp and the fire in the stove. Her massive woodpile was visible in the inner chamber, dry and perfectly organized. She offered him a hot cup of coffee, and he accepted gratefully, his half-frozen fingers wrapping around the warm tin mug. He told her the news from town, of the sickness and the struggle, the dwindling supplies. He had brought her a sack of fresh ground coffee and a small wheel of cheese, refusing any payment. He looked around the shelter, at the solid stone walls, the neat shelves she had carved into the limestone, the general air of competence. "By God, Elsie," he said, his voice filled with awe, "you've built yourself a better home than any in Argent." His visit was the beginning. Word of the widow in the rock and her warm, efficient shelter spread through the suffering town. The first to seek her out was Sarah Gable, another widow from the mine collapse, whose small shack at the edge of town was notoriously drafty. She arrived with her 2 young children, their faces pinched and blue with cold. She had run out of dry firewood. Elsie did not offer charity, which she knew would only wound the other woman's pride. She offered knowledge. She gave Mrs. Gable a hot meal and sat her children by the stove. Then she took out a piece of shale and with a shard of limestone drew a diagram. She explained the principles of a windbreak, showing her how to build a simple wall of snow and rock around her door. She taught her how to bring a day's worth of wood inside each evening to dry by the fire for the next morning. She explained how banking the fire with slow-burning hardwoods could make it last through the night. Finally, she gave her an armload of her own seasoned pine. "To get you started," she said simply. Sarah Gable left not just with firewood, but with a strategy. Within days, others followed. A miner whose wife was sick with pneumonia came seeking advice on how to keep their room at a constant temperature. A young couple with a newborn baby asked how she kept her shelter so free of smoke and drafts. Elsie taught them all. She became an unlikely consultant on the physics of warmth, the engineering of survival. She drew diagrams of stovepipe installation, explained the importance of ventilation, and demonstrated how to stack a woodpile for optimal drying. She gave freely of her knowledge, the inheritance from Arthur now passed on to the very community that had allowed her to be cast out. She did not do it out of forgiveness, but out of a deeper, more practical empathy. She understood their desperation because she had faced it herself and overcome it. In the heart of that brutal winter, the woman who had been deemed a disposable liability had become the town's most valuable resource. In late April, as the snows began to recede and the first signs of spring appeared on the south-facing slopes, a man arrived in Argent who was different from the miners and merchants. He was Dr. Alistair Finch, a geologist with the United States Geological Survey, a man in his early 50s with a tweed jacket, a neatly trimmed beard, and an air of quiet, academic authority. He was in the region to survey mineral claims and to update the federal government's topographical maps. Finch had in his possession copies of several professional papers written by an engineer named Arthur Vance. He admired the man's work. It was precise, insightful, and showed a profound understanding of the region's complex geology. In Argent, while inquiring about Vance, he was told the tragic story of his death and the subsequent fate of his widow. The townspeople spoke of her with a new, grudging respect, telling him the story of the widow in the rock who had survived the great cold. They told him how she had taught them to weather the winter. Intrigued by this story of resilience and by his professional respect for her late husband, Finch decided to seek her out. He found her not in her shelter, but outside, turning over a small patch of soil she was preparing for a garden. She greeted him with a reserved composure, her hands stained with dirt. She was wary, but when he mentioned Arthur's name and spoke of his work with genuine admiration, she relaxed slightly. She agreed to show him what she had built. Finch was not a man easily impressed, but as he crawled through the entrance and stood in her stone chamber, he was silent for a long time. He was not seeing a crude survivalist's hovel. He was seeing a masterful work of applied science. He ran his hand over the dry stack wall. "Excellent craftsmanship," he murmured. "No mortar, but perfectly stable." He noted the southern exposure, the ventilation crack, the positioning of the stove for optimal heat convection. This is a remarkable example of passive solar design and the use of geothermal stability, he said, more to himself than to her. Whoever built this had an intuitive grasp of thermodynamics. "My husband taught me," Elsie said quietly. "He understood how the earth works." She showed him Arthur's journal, open to the page with the sketch of the fissure. Finch read the notes, his eyes lighting up with professional excitement. "Of course," he said. He saw the potential immediately, the thermal advantage. Brilliant. Then she showed him the inner chamber and told him the story of Jedediah Morse, producing the Civil War-era journal. Finch's excitement grew. This was not just a geological curiosity. It was a site of historical significance. He spent 2 hours with her, taking precise measurements, making sketches in his own notebook, and asking her detailed questions about her construction methods and her daily routines during the winter. He did not treat her as a desperate woman, but as a colleague, an expert in her own right. His respect was not a kindness. It was a professional recognition of her competence. "Mrs. Vance," he said as he prepared to leave, his tone serious. "What you have done here is more than just survive. You have homesteaded this land. By right of improvement and habitation, you have a legal claim to it. Furthermore, the discovery of the historical artifacts in the inner chamber makes this a site of official interest." He paused, looking at her directly. "The Argent Consolidated Mining Company evicted you from a house they owned. But this house you built yourself, from the mountain itself. It is yours by a more fundamental law." He told her he would be filing an official report with the Federal Land Office. He would document her improvements, register her claim, and formally note the historical significance of the site. His testimony, as a representative of the federal government, would carry significant legal weight. He was not rescuing her. He was translating her work, her labor, her intelligence, her resilience, into a language the outside world, the world of laws and deeds and titles, would be forced to understand and recognize. The expert's validation was not what gave her work value. The warmth through the winter had already done that. But it was the key that would unlock the door to a final, public reckoning. Dr. Finch's report, submitted to the Department of the Interior and copied to the state authorities in Denver, landed with the force of a well-placed dynamite charge. It was a dry, factual document, but its implications were explosive. He detailed the remarkable vernacular architecture and applied geological principles of Elsie Vance's shelter. He documented her discovery of Jedediah Morse's remains and journal, formally establishing the site's historical value. But he did not stop there. In his preamble, he coolly noted the circumstances that had led to Mrs. Vance's extraordinary undertaking. Her eviction by the Argent Consolidated Mining Company following the death of her husband in a mine collapse that was, itself, a matter of public record. The report created a quiet but unstoppable chain reaction. A journalist in Denver got hold of the story and wrote a feature for the Rocky Mountain News under the headline, "Widow evicted by mining giant builds superior home in mountain, survives brutal winter while town shivers." The story, picked up by papers back east, was a public relations disaster for Argent Consolidated. The company, which prided itself on its modern, benevolent paternalism, was portrayed as a heartless corporation that cast widows out into the snow. The federal investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Finch's report had given it teeth. Investigators re-examined the No. 4 shaft collapse, finding evidence of negligence and cost-cutting measures that Arthur Vance had reportedly warned his superiors about. Silas Croft, the superintendent, was found to have ignored those warnings. He was quietly dismissed, his career ruined. Faced with a federal inquiry, potential lawsuits, and a cascade of negative press, the board of directors of Argent Consolidated moved to contain the damage. Their lawyers traveled to Argent and, with Dr. Finch acting as an informal mediator, met with Elsie Vance. They did not meet her in a corporate office, but at the entrance to her stone shelter. They offered her a formal apology and a settlement. It was not $50. It was $5,000, a sum that represented more than 10 years of her husband's salary. Furthermore, they offered her the legal deed to a 20-acre plot of land surrounding her shelter, encompassing that entire section of the Sentinel's spine. Elsie listened to the offer without expression. She did not rail against them for the injustice they had done her. She did not celebrate her victory. She simply accepted the terms with a quiet, powerful dignity. The reckoning was not triumphant. It was transactional, as cold and administrative as the original eviction notice had been. The company also established a small pension fund for the other widows of the No. 4 collapse, a move that salvaged some of their tarnished reputation. The money was deposited in her name at the bank in Silver Plume. The deed was registered with the county clerk. The truth had been documented, and the injustice, in its way, had been reversed. But the cost remained. Arthur was still dead. The months of back-breaking labor and profound loneliness were gone forever. The calluses on her hands and the quiet ache in her back were permanent reminders. With a portion of the settlement, she bought a small, well-built house in the town of Argent, a place with glass windows and a proper door. It would be her concession to the harshest months of winter, a base of operations. But she did not abandon her shelter on the mountain. It remained her true home. The script of her life closed not with a wedding or a departure, but with a quiet coda of self-reliance. The final scenes of her story would show her, in the warm light of a late summer afternoon, methodically restocking the inner chamber of her stone shelter. She sawed and split firewood, stacking it with the familiar, satisfying precision she had mastered. She brought up sacks of flour and beans, cans of coffee and peaches, lining them up on the stone shelves she had carved. The shelter was not a relic of a desperate time. It was a part of her, a statement of her own sovereignty. She had not been rescued. She had rescued herself. The world had tried to erase her, to write her off as a liability. She had answered by carving a permanent and irrefutable existence for herself out of the rock of the earth. The shelter remained hers, kept ready, a silent testament to the woman who had faced the cold, the cruelty, and the calculation, and had met them all with her own.